university professor, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who was expelled from the university during the military regime, banned from teaching. That's the reason he became a politician. Then we were led by a former union leader, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who, in his fourth attempt to become president, succeeded. Lula da Silva was the first man of the people in Brazil, in this very unequal society, to win a presidential election and to govern reasonably well. So you can understand how, positive we have been until very recently about Brazil. We are changing, and what Lula himself, his ascension as president, proved that this very unequal country could have a president from the people. It's a common experience for Americans. You can name very easily 3 or 4 or 5 presidents that were, as young people like you, and that emerged because of their qualities and became leaders of the country. In Brazil, Lula was the first one. And this was very affirming of our democracy in Brazil. And we started to, under President Lula, and building on what President Cardoso and others had done, we started to invest in society to make it more equal, to reduce poverty in Brazil, to give people a little bit more of opportunity through sometimes government-mandated programs. It worked, and Brazil has integrated, has lifted from poverty. Some numbers vary, 35 or 40 million people in a country of 200 million people. It's quite a feat. It's quite important, quite significant. President Lula is succeeded 4 years ago, or three and a half years ago or so, by, again, another notable fact in democracy, in our democratic evolution. The first woman president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff. Important fact. But Dilma Rousseff, very admired by Brazilians for being an honest politician, a very hard-working person, but under whose leadership Brazil has started to falter economically. Her expectations that Brazil would grow 4% a year, with low inflation, with gaining efficiency, gaining productivity, did not materialize. It was very disappointing. And what became evident during her presidency is that the economic model of Brazil, based on consumption, based on distributing income, which is necessary, is exhausting or has exhausted itself. That we need to rethink our economy to make it more productive and to make it, to build a base, a new base for the economy. It's a base of investments. Investment, development knowledge, of technology, better education, development of human capital. One of the main complaints of businesses in Brazil, of government officials in Brazil, is that we lack the people that we need to work in vital activities, functions of either the governments or the private sector. Second challenge is the infrastructure of Brazil. What I mentioned about the stadiums, what I mentioned about the transportation network, very clear need to invest, which gives Brazil a wonderful opportunity. This is about investing in ourselves, investing in the quality of the country. But in order to do that efficiently, you have to have an economy, a system that allows for that to happen. And we don't. We do not have a flexible economy like the United States does. We have regulatory frameworks that don't work very well. We have had, in the current past, a reversion of a trend that we had under Cardoso and initially under Lula, to be careful about the way the state is present in the economy. It is important that the public sector be present, but you have to do a good calibration on that. And the general criticism now in Brazil is that the state has, following another tradition of Brazil, has become overbearing again, inhibiting initiative. It has been a problem, not of this government, but of previous governments. Excessive taxation, excessive bureaucracy, and we find ourselves today in this very difficult position. The economy is not growing very well, very fast. We know there is no expectations. You don't have a politician, even those that are supportive of the government, that would make a prediction that next year Brazil will really go and we start growing vigorously again. They know that. That is not in the cards. Inflation under control, but lots of pressure, putting pressure in the economy that is inefficient. And we have also important part, and here refers to the United States and to our relations with the rest of the world. We have had also a inward-looking orientation in the current government. It's inevitable because given the problems the country faces, which are domestic problems, they are generated domestically, although obviously the international environment continues to weigh heavily and the consequences of the 2008 global crisis continues to be present. We know in Brazil that the challenges we face right now comes from inside Brazil. Brazil has turned inward-looking and has sort of lost the capacity it had demonstrated historically, but especially under Cardoso and Lula, to act internationally in a productive, pragmatic way. Nevertheless, through efforts of diplomats on both countries, Brazil and the United States, there were efforts to these two societies to continue to work together. It was very symbolic and important when President Obama, in March of 2011, went to Brazil to pay a visit to the newly inaugurated President Dilma Rousseff. It was the first time that an American president visited a Brazilian president before being visited by that president. Very significant, and was received as that. Then there were efforts. President Dilma came to the United States in a working visit, and then they worked on having a state visit by the Brazilian president to Washington, which scheduled for October last year, would have been the first visit by a state visit since 1995. I remember that very well because I covered that as a journalist. President Cardoso was received by President Clinton with pomp and circumstance at the White House. As you probably know, that visit did not take place because of the revelations of spying activities by the National Security Agency just before the visit was supposed to happen, led the president of Brazil to postpone or cancel the visit. We don't know which, but it didn't happen. Led also to the reversal of a decision, according to credible reports published by the press, to reverse a decision to acquire some new jet fighters, American jet fighters from Boeing, to re-equip the Brazilian Air Force, which would have been the first strategic engagement event between Brazil and the United States in many, many decades. Well, it didn't happen, and we are kind of stuck in our bilateral dialogue right now. Yes, the two presidents will shake hands, or the Vice President Biden and President Dilma Rousseff met yesterday, I think, in Santiago during the inauguration of Michelle Bachelet, but exchanged some pleasantries, but we have a sense, and you have that in Brazil and Washington, that the relationship is not well. And that's a pity, and that's not good. I know it's not good for Brazil. because it adds to this perception of difficulties Brazil is facing to engage with the world. I believe that the president was very justified in reacting the way she reacted to the revelation of snooping on her and on Brazil. It was a breach of trust, basically, but we have to move on. And they are having difficulties connecting those, going forward, moving forward, and overcoming that difficulty. Now, if you talk, there is another thing two more things I wanted to highlight to you in this brief presentation. First of all, you can see in Brazil, although for most Brazilians, most Brazilians, especially ones that are in the lower levels of social development in Brazil, you can see that there is satisfaction to what has happened. People that makes up to 4 or 5 minimum wages in Brazil, which is around, well, today, $350 a month, are having a good time. The economy of Brazil for that sector has been growing at 6, 7, 8% a year. But the economy as a whole has not grown that much. Although there is satisfaction in part of society, which justifies and explains the popularity of President Dilma Rousseff, you have generally in society a sense that things are not going well. This sense sort of exploded into public view in June of last year, when you have major protests, massive protests in state capitals and major cities, in about 600 cities in Brazil. Those protests were not predicted by or expected by the government or by the opposition or by the media or by the political science professors. Nobody knew it coming. And it came and it shocked the country. The popularity of the president, that was very high, over 60%, came down to 30. It's back to 40, which gives her probably a good chance of being reelected, maybe even in the first round of presidential elections we are going to have in October. But there is this sense that something is out of whack. There is an anxiety. I like to use the metaphor, remember the Reverend Martin Luther King last speech, the evening before he was assassinated, the famous speech about the mountaintop. I think Brazilian as a society, thanks to the progress we made, we have been to the mountaintop. We kind of saw the promised land. But I think there is an apprehension in Brazil that we may not get there. We may not get there because in order to continue to moving ahead, we need to do what is urgent now, which is to reform the economy, to reconvert the economy, to add quality to the economy and to give people hope. And if it's true that in the less educated part of society, which is most of Brazil, the hope is still there, that things are improving and, all lanes are moving. Well, you can see young, talented people in Brazil very frustrated right now. We are hearing things that we are not used at hearing. People that call you and say, I want to go out, I want to spend some time abroad because I don't see many good things happening to me. This is a very strange thing for us. This is very strange. People say things are stopping to work. Even if you discount for the fact that some of this criticism is reflected by media, and media tends to be critical because that's the function of media. That's to challenge power. I don't want to be, pessimistic when people say, things don't work in Brazil. It's not possible to do things in Brazil because there are too many regulations and the government may be predisposed against businesses and the government may have adopted a strategy of picking winners, which we know that not always work, or most of the time do not. Uh, so there is this pessimism. Now, we have in Brazil the solutions for all those problems. It's not as though we do not have them. It is now we are going to have an opportunity until October to have a debate in a presidential election that where President Dilma Rousseff will face two main challengers, senator from the state of Minas Gerais, the party of President Fernando Henrique Cardoso, PSDB. His name is Aécio Neves, and he is probably going to be the candidate for that party. Also, Governor Eduardo Campos from the state of Pernambuco, a younger politician, 48, was minister, like President Dilma Rousseff, was a minister of President Lula, and was a congressman, was later elected to the state of Pernambuco, to the governorship, was re-elected with 82% of the vote, was the politician that President Lula was grooming to be maybe, after a second successful term of President Dilma Rousseff, to be the continuation, because he is part of that coalition. He is a leader of the Brazilian Socialist Party. And it happens, though, that Governor Campos has left that coalition and announced that he is going to run, he is going to challenge the president. We know from press reports that the President Lula, who is a very astute politician, fears the possibility of Governor Campos forcing President Dilma Rousseff to a second round of elections, where he thinks that Campos would have a chance. It doesn't appear likely right now even that there will be a second round, but it's an interesting thing to keep in mind. There are other factors that may influence in this, especially something very present right now, which is the difficulty, the PT, the Workers' Party, President Dilma's party, President Lula's party, to keep together the coalition that supports them in Congress with the PMDB, which is a very large center-right party. Now, about things that, despite all the difficulties, I mentioned the solutions for Brazil are in Brazil. We know that, and it's not because Rose and Gary are here that I'm going to mention that, but you may have heard of a company called Azul. It's an airliner that was started by David Neeleman, who, as you probably know, is American and is Brazilian. He was born in Rua Conselheiro Brotero, in São Paulo, at the Samaritan Hospital there. David built an airline, a very successful airline company in Brazil. And he used the other success of Brazil to do that, which is called, is named Embraer. It used to be a state company, was privatized by President Fernando Henrique Cardoso and flourished. And today is the third largest airplane builder in the world. So we know in Brazil, despite all the difficulties, that we can do things as complex and sophisticated as becoming a builder of airplanes and being successful in that. And we know from David's experience and from other experience that despite all the difficulties, if you tap the right markets, if you have the right models, if you have the determination, you can be successful in Brazil as a business person. His company today, Azul, flies to 160 destinations, has 2,000 employees, and what we need in Brazil, though, are more Embraers, are more companies like Azul, are to repeat the pattern that we know that works in Brazil, and we are having problems with that. And I wanted to leave you with that story because I do not think the picture is as bleak as it looks from time to time, as obviously I don't believe that the picture is as nice as some people would like us to believe. Remember, The Economist in 2009 had a cover story of the Christ the Redeemer in Rio, taken off from Corcovado Mountain in Rio. And then 3 years later, they got, the reverse of that. The Christ the Redeemer was crashing down. Actually, the first thing was an exaggeration. The second thing, again, another exaggeration. But the perception that Brazil is headed to a complicated moment is clear, regardless of the outcome of the elections. We are going to have to face next year, most like an economic crisis, maybe with a balance of payment problem, a heavy internal indebtedness, and a doubt about our capacity to overcome that. And I wanted to leave you with that thought and ask you to follow the debates during the presidential election campaign. If you go to our site on next Monday at around 12:30 your time, there will be a webcast live of a debate on the prospects of a panoramic view of the presidential elections. We have also there at our sites a very interesting publication about a presentation former U.S. Ambassador to Brazil, Tom Shannon, did there about this moment in the relationship, complicated moment. So I invite you to take a look at our site. And with that, I would like to, I don't know, Rex, how is the proceeding here, but
we have time for some questions, and so if you wouldn't mind using the microphone, and again, tell us your name and major, and ask your question at the microphone.
and if you don't, I will continue to talk. No questions? Man, this is better than I thought. They know everything about Brazil.
So, what would be, hold on,
Apparently, you have to use the mic. Professor's order.
So, what would be your predictions for when we're going to start seeing, like, the entire economy of Brazil kind of climbing?
I am not an economist, thank God. Because they know a lot of stuff that I don't. But I get economists to predict things, or they're lucky because people, I think, don't check later on if they were right or wrong. But it's a very difficult thing. Most people in Brazil predict that we are headed to hard times in terms of finding this path of reconverting the economy to a animal that can fly sustainably at higher altitudes. We have an expression in Portuguese that's wonderful, and that Professor Nielsen and Rose and Gary knows very well. It is, and Cristiane also, it's a voo da galinha, the chicken flight. Have you seen a chicken fly? Because the chicken is not aerodynamically built to fly. It flies with a lot of effort. Doesn't fly very high. It doesn't go the distance. It flies. It's ugly. And we use that expression in Brazil to say that we are always confronted with the chicken flight, because our economy is not aerodynamic enough to go and lift and sustain and get speed. And that's what we need to do. Some of the challenges of the Brazilian economy, exist in the United States. You are confronted, and I am in Washington, and I follow this. Many people in the United States say that the challenge of the United States today, where the middle class, contrary to what is happening in Brazil, the middle class in the United States is shrinking. And part of the problem is, President Obama says that, it's not innovative enough. It's not innovative at the degree it should be. There are problems in education. Different nature at a different scale. But just imagine in Brazil. And President Dilma Rousseff is perfectly aware of this. She, in 2012, made the speech at the end of the year to journalists. It's an interview, actually, where she was asked about this fiscal cliff the United States was facing. And the question was loaded, saying, the United States with the fiscal cliff, it's going to go down, and, so what do you think? And she said, I don't think that the United States is losing importance. I think the United States, that's very interesting. The United States has a very flexible economy. The United States has a great capacity to innovate and to reinvent itself. And I wonder, when reading that, what's she thinking about Brazil? Because if you think about Brazil, you cannot make those statements. And I think that she is. For instance, there is a program that she started called Science Without Borders, which recognizes the problem of education in Brazil, especially on science, technology, engineering, and math, where the how-to-do disciplines that you need to learn and develop in order to do things better. And she started a program that has, in the past 2.5 years, almost 3 years, brought about 50,000 kids, university students abroad, to be at least 1 year abroad. Which recognizes the need to invest in people at that level, to improve the quality of workers in Brazil at all levels, and of managers, etc. So I believe that the president understands that. I believe that the candidates that are challenging her understand the challenge, the question, the problems we face, or what you call the hardest problem, the hardest part comes now, is to negotiate internally in democracy the agreements that are necessary to keep us moving forward. This is not easy to do there, as it is not easy to do here in the United States. All the debates about more or less taxation, more or less government intervention, et cetera, et cetera. But this is the picture. It's not a one-year affair that you're going to see Brazil going up again. This is something that requires a lot of effort and requires a lot of leadership in Brazil.
Recently, the military police has increased its forces by 15,000, and there are new terrorism laws that might get passed. I was wondering if you see this new militarization of Brazil contributing to possibly a new political shift like we saw in the 80s.
I think I know where you're going. I think that this comes not only because certain areas, major cities in Brazil, have a problem of safety, crime, etc. This has been a problem. If you take the most successful experiences in trying to confront this issue, you would see that what we have done goes in the opposite direction. Take, for instance, one example, which is called the Unities of Pacifying Police in Rio de Janeiro, which is to do community policing, to have people, they have actually retrained. They hire young officers that do not have the bad habits of the tradition officers formed probably still under the culture of the military regime, and to say, you have to go, we are going to occupy positions in those neighborhoods. Actually, they change even the names. It used to be favelas, now it's communities. It's a very smart kind of approach. But you're going to stay there. You're going to live with that community. You are going to do community policing. Actually, there are positive stories in some areas. Apparently, there is a commander, a woman, commander of their military police people. A lot of patricias, young girls, were born in that neighborhood that are named Patricia because the commander of that unit is a Patricia that apparently worked very well with the community. So I'm giving you a small example of something that suggests to me that the successful interventions are in the opposite direction of what you have just suggested. ideas of bringing, sort of redefining what terrorism is in Brazil comes from a sort of a variation of the protests. We had the protests in Brazil in June. They were mostly peaceful. But then something emerged called the Black Blocs, which are groups of anarchists or fascists, or I don't know how to classify them, that are expert in attacking commerce, and especially bank branches, and breaking them down. And it's against that type of activity, and people that use masks, and it's against that type of activity that politicians in Brazil started discussing this idea that you just mentioned to redefine terrorism. I don't think that is going to go, that is going to pass. I think there was a reaction in society against that, but it shows how lost politicians are to confront those new issues. We had, and we were discussing earlier today, something also very interesting that emerged recently called the rolezinhos. The rolezinhos are, I think, there is a name for that, flash mob in the United States, which you have kids going to shopping malls and being there, because that's public space. It's privately run, but it's supposed to work like a public square. And you have people apprehensive because due to this rising middle class, you have more and more Brazilians that look like most Brazilians, which is all shades between black and white. And they go and they are seen as a threat, as a potential. This is a reality we have to deal with because they have the right to be in the shopping malls. I don't think that we are going towards this sort of militarization. I don't think that the president or her opponents would agree with that, or the leadership would, although we are starting a political campaign, and political campaigns have a power to make politicians say and do the most stupid things. So, and not only in Brazil. So I don't know if I answer your question, but be hopeful that we will behave.
Right. I don't know very much about the economy of Brazil, and I'm no expert on this, obviously. But so from what I understand from what you're saying, the problems that are facing Brazil right now is that the economy isn't flexible enough. Like, would you care to elaborate on that? Like, they're not producing basically products that are meeting the demands of the people or of the global economy, or what is exactly happening that is creating this economic downturn?
A bit of all of you just said. For instance, the Brazilian economy used to export a lot of manufactured products. We still do to the United States especially. But in this economic shift that is happening in the world with the emerging economies of China, of India, and others, Brazil has, due to high prices of commodities, converted the profile of its exports has changed, and we have become principally an export of commodities, of primary products, with lower value added, okay? So this is a problem. Some people believe China is now the largest trading partner of Brazil. Some very experienced Brazilian economists, diplomats, and others believe that our relationship to China, and this is not China's problem, this is our problem, has become a sort of a neo-colonial relationship, where we send the raw materials and buy the finished products. This is the pattern. This is the type of problem, again, due to lack of low-level skills, lack of workers with enough skills. The economy is not productive. Also, the messages sent sometimes by the central government are not ones that build trust in investors to invest in Brazil. And it's not only the foreign investors, or the Brazilian investors also. So you have this negative moment, and the Brazilian business community, if you read the Brazilian newspaper, and you can read statements by leaders of the community saying that publicly, we do not trust the government because there have been repeated manifestations of a sort of a controlling attitude that investors and businessmen don't accept very easily. So it's a combination of that, and we cannot claim ignorance about the problem. We know what the problem is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So you mentioned, sorry. So you mentioned the importance of Brazil and its internal investments, right? What do you envision, or what do you think the government envisions with their recent investments in Cuba, in the port in Cuba? What do you think they envision for the financial return and kind of the relationship with the United States, if that will affect it at all?
I think it's a complicated question. I believe Brazil, as most countries in the region, hope for a peaceful transition, inevitable transition that is coming in Cuba, that it happens in peace, that it allows the 12 million Cubans that live in Cuba to redefine their destiny, and that Cuba is allowed to be a full member of the international community. As you probably know, the economic embargo the United States has had over Cuba is highly unpopular all over the region. It's, I believe, highly unpopular also the business community in the United States. What some Brazilian companies have been doing is to say, well, let's start with, along with the Spanish companies, along with the French companies, along with members of the OECD companies, that let's invest there to allow this transition to happen. The Cubans are talented people, and once the system starts, and it has started to change already, there is also an ideological element. The people that govern Brazil today, the Workers' Party, are ideologically close to the socialists in Cuba, of the Cuban Revolution. So there is a sympathy. Some choices are guided by that. This is a subject of major discussion internally in Brazil, major controversy in the media in Brazil, as, for instance, what's happening in Venezuela today. In Brazil, the government has been very heavily criticized for not taking a firmer stand against what is perceived as a breach of rights of Venezuelans to protest. Actually, former President Fernando Henrique Cardoso, just last week, joined other former presidents of Chile, of Costa Rica, of Peru, to appeal to the Venezuelans, to all of them, government and opposition, to search for a way to resolve their differences peacefully and to stay, to respect the will of the people. They are saying democracy is the way to do this, to resolve this issue. But most Brazilians know that there is an ideological element associated with Brazilian choices vis-à-vis Cuba. I tend to think that the deeper choice is a practical one, okay, is to see and help Cuba. And this is what the perspective of the business community that is involved in this. This involves some very major construction companies in Brazil, building the port of Mariel in Cuba. We said, let's do this, and we have to have many Mariels. So when the transition comes, or it's already starting, that it will be smooth. It will allow the Cubans to enjoy a better life. Obviously, this is my choice and the choice of many in Brazil, that the Cubans have what we have in Brazil, which is more freedom and democracy.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm Veronica. I study communications, and I'm actually from Macaé, Rio de Janeiro. And as a Brazilian citizen, what can I do to help my country?
First, is to study like there is no tomorrow. First thing, she's from the oil capital of Brazil.
My father works for Petrobras.
Yes, and the first advice is that. Follow the debate. Participate. Don't be shy about this. I I go to a lot of things like that, and I meet with the kids from the Science Without Border program. And I tend to tell them, and I always tell them, say, Brazil is going to be what you decide it is going to be. There is a phrase by a great musician in Brazil, Geraldo Vandré. You remember him. Quem sabe faz a hora. Não espera acontecer. Those that know what the challenge is, make their hour, make their time, you know, influence events. They don't they don't wait things to happen. So what I would tell you is to study a lot and be a leader.